Welcome to the second episode of Paradigm Sherpas. I'm your host, Ryan Donnelly, and today I am honored to introduce our guest, Dr. Jensine Andresen. Dr. Andresen has a civil engineering degree from Princeton, a master's in social anthropology from Columbia, and a PhD from Harvard in Indo-Tibetan Buddhist Studies. She's written numerous books. Some of those include Bohm's Interpretation of Quantum Theory, Extraterrestrial Ethics, Hyperconflation, which is about recommending a relational alternative to the data-centric approach to UAP, or unidentified anomalous phenomenon, and Hyperconvergence, which examines religion, politics, and UFOs, and how they all intersect and interplay with each other. Dr. Andresen recently appeared on Steven Spielberg's docuseries Encounters. She's on episode 4. Dr. Andresen has done exhaustive research over the years into numerous subjects, and the depth of her knowledge is well matched by her empathy and optimism for humanity. She's here to talk to us today about how we can center ourselves in a more sound ontology. Dr. Andresen's also going to walk us through history, theory, practice, and ethics. We start our conversation off today with a discussion of David Bohm and his interpretation of quantum theory. And with that, I am tremendously honored to introduce today's Paradigm Sherpa, Dr. Jensine Andresen.
When I was thinking about today's conversation, I was thinking that I really wanted to focus on sort of 4 things. And they all have a common denominator, which is how you approach anything, how you approach any topic. And so I was thinking in terms of history, theory, practice, and ethics or morality. And the Bohmian piece is very much having to do with theory. But it's not theory in a vacuum, because it's theory that helps us understand history. So I won't say too much. Anybody can look up Bohm's, bio on, just Wikipedia or whatever, but
Okay, so I did look up David Bohm, and here's the scoop. He got his PhD from Cal Berkeley in 1943. His professor, Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, tried to recruit him to Los Alamos to participate in the Manhattan Project, the top secret project to build the atomic bomb. Bohm was actually denied security clearance by General Leslie Groves because Bohm had Communist Party leanings in his time at Berkeley. After Bohm graduates from Berkeley, his work is immediately classified under the protection of the Manhattan Project. That means Bohm is completely cut off from his graduate thesis work.
he was a fascinating man. And in my estimation, he was the most sophisticated physicist that understood the nature and the meaning of quantum theory much more than his historical compatriots. And so because of some unfortunate rivalry, Bohm was the last PhD student of Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer, I think, was quite jealous of Bohm. Unfortunately, it's really tragic. And so what happened was that Oppenheimer essentially blackballed Bohm. And the upshot of that has been that people have not read Bohm, even physicists, because they simply went with Oppenheimer's word on the matter instead of reading Bohm's very important papers from the early 1950s and then his later work. And so I have a lot of interests, but I have 2 very important interests that I finally realized trying to solve them or trying to offer anything useful about these 2 interests that I'll mention in a moment, it finally occurred to me it was one and the same problem. And part of it was, why is it that history repeats? And of course, it doesn't repeat precisely, but it certainly cycles in a way that everybody recognizes there's a repetitive element to it. And I wondered, why is that? And it occurred to me that it was more than just cultural or generational passing on of ideas or revenge cycles or, this sort of thing, that there was something else going on there that was deeper. And the other question that I think a lot about is, why is it so difficult for an advanced extraterrestrial species to acculturate with us? Why is that? What are we doing as human beings that is making that so difficult? And I think we are doing some things as human beings that are very maladaptive, and that makes it difficult for any other species to approach us without human beings hurting ourselves.
If you're curious to know more about why it would be so difficult for an extraterrestrial intelligence to acculturate with human beings, I suggest you take a look at Dr. Andresen's book, Extraterrestrial Ethics. It's a great place to get started.
And it occurred to me that this negative repetition in history and the glacial pace of the acculturation process, that there was something common to both of them. And to try to get at what that might be, then I started looking into Bohm's framework more. So that's kind of see, for me, academics, or, I never set out to be this way. I never set out to be an academic. I never set, even though I taught in the university for a number of years, I never set out to teach in academia. I set out because I get interested in certain questions and I really want to understand them. And I read and I read and I read and I read some more. And then I try to, back in the day, took some classes, and then I realized it was enough for a degree, and that you get the degree. It was all sort of by happenstance. But what drives me are the questions. So, and I don't want to just make this too much of a monologue. So I'll say a couple of things about Bohm's framework. And then, since you've read the book, and I really appreciate the depth of your reading, Ryan, it's very meaningful to me that you read so carefully. I would like you to, ask questions so that we can kind of address it back and forth in a dialogue. But nevertheless, to set the stage, there's this question of the frame. Where is the frame? How does one place the frame on existence? Like, what is existence? What is the nature of existence? And that is the real meaning of the term ontology, is inquiry into the nature of reality, or to the nature of existence. It's not how it's been thrown around in UFO Twitter in the last few months, the ontological shock. No, that's not what it means. That's very much more just cultural shock or cosmological shock, if you really want to push it, but it's not ontological shock. So ontology, just to get clear on that, it means what is the nature, and it's really an emphasis on this term nature, the nature of reality. So what is so unique about Bohm's framework is he presents, unlike anybody else really, an ontological interpretation of the quantum theory, which means that it's causal, which means that it was not enough for Bohm. Bohm really was on the path, he wanted to understand. And so just because Bohr or somebody else said, you can't go beyond this statistical approach, that wasn't good enough for Bohm. He kept trying to understand the causal or the ontological implications of quantum theory. And so his framework, basically, I'll explain it without recourse to mathematics or physics equations, just, kind of describing it. So essentially, there's this reality that Bohm calls explicate reality. And most people, especially now, are socialized into thinking that that's all there is. It's the reality of the five senses, and that's it. It's what we see. It's what's available to our sensory organs, right? The objects of our senses. And that's that, right? And Bohm is saying, no, there is beyond that the implicate order, and beyond that the super implicate order, and beyond that the super implicate order. And you can take this all the way to infinity, potentially. So what is he saying? He's saying that there is a series of ordering principles. So that the explicate, what we see, is essentially ordered by the implicate. And the implicate is essentially ordered by the super implicate. And this is, and so on. And this is how you can bring in the notion of the subtle. So each of these ordering levels of order, is more subtle than the one prior to it. So the most coarse is the explicate.
Yeah.
And the implicate is subtler. And super implicate is subtler even than that, right? And so the path, and I'm using that almost in a mystical sense, but I don't mean it in the way that people tend to mean mysticism, but the path of engagement, when I'm talking about practice, I think is really how one trains one's own perceptual embodiment to be able to perceive the implicate. And then on the basis of, I'm
yes, can I pause you for just a second? So I think
you can pause me after I finish my sentence.
Sure.
So the question is, how do you perceive the implicate ordering principle? How do you perceive the implicate beyond the explicate? Okay, pause away.
Okay, so the concepts of implicate, explicate, and subtle can be a little bit confusing. To help me out, I put this image of Plato's allegory of the cave up. Plato's allegory of the cave says that there's a group of people who have been chained to a pole facing forward their entire lives. All they can see are shadows or images up on this cave wall. To them, those images are the only reality. They tell themselves stories about what those images are and what they represent and the relationship to those images. Now, as we can see from the picture, there's a lot more going on here. And I think that's what Dr. Andresen is saying that Bohm tells us. There's a lot more going on behind the scenes that's not physical, that's implicate or subtle. Now, most of us in our waking lives think that the explicate or physical reality is all there is, and I'm including myself. I believe that that is a similar condition to the person chained to the pole here, looking at the shadows on the wall. Dr. Andresen and Bohm suggest that, hey, maybe there's a path to unchain ourselves and get more familiar with other aspects of reality that, while not physical, are very equally real.
Perfect. That was awesome. So the implicate is the unseen, right? Is what you're saying. The explicate is the manifest.
Yeah. So,
okay.
So yes, the implicate is that from which the manifest manifests.
Yes.
One might want to call it source. It's not that, though. I mean, it's tricky because if you say source, then you reify it, and then it makes it sound like that's it, and there's nothing beyond that. But let me put it this way. The implicate is the immediate precursor to the manifestation of what we see in the explicate. It's the first level of it. Okay.
Well, and I think it's so important to just point that out fundamentally, because you said earlier, most of us, and I'm guilty of it, majority of my everyday waking life, but I'm becoming more conscious of it, is that like I do just look at the outside world and this is it, and I take everything that I've been fed from it as truth, and it's shaped my worldviews and thus shapes how I behave and operate. And now I'm in this process, as many others, which is why I'm so grateful we're connecting, and other people who are seeking this path or knowledge or way to change can. And I think what you're presenting here is certainly a path people can approach that's practical and can lead them to transforming their lives a little. And it's just saying, hey, this outside stuff isn't all there is. There's a bigger picture, a potentially infinite bigger picture that we don't see through these 5 sense apparatus. And that's really the big story under the tip of the iceberg. And the more we can develop that relationship with it, feel the layers of subtlety, if you will, the better we'll be able to navigate and enjoy maybe our experience here in life.
Well, it's
Does that sound
huge.
fair?
It's yes, and it's huge. It's like when it dawns on you, and it doesn't necessarily, for me anyway, maybe, someone else, it might be more of a sudden realization, but for me, it took a while until I started to understand just how profound the implications were. The implications are enormous because essentially we're perceiving everything inside out. We're making primary that which is secondary, and we're not even seeing what's primary. So now, again, that's because that's an epiphenomenon or a byproduct of perception and embodiment, how it is we perceive anything, and enculturation. So our culture, which over time has become so routinized and coarse, frankly, in the sense of being very instrumentalists, like we're very reliant, increasingly reliant, which I think is really tragic, on technology. And so in a sense, we're dumbing ourselves down, you could say, because we are almost unteaching ourselves this natural ability to perceive the implicate. And when you are immersed in it, like when you're feeling it, when you're connected to it, there is joy. I mean, like there's inherent joy. And you think about, for example, children, the inherent joy that children have when they're just playing, they're like so immersed fully, right? And they're playing and they manifest joy. And that's inherently available to everybody, but it gets beaten out of us. And it gets beaten out of us because of how a lot is simply the educational system beats it out of us. But certain religious communities might teach people that what's primary is a certain belief narrative. And so people get caught up in their heads, frankly, in their thoughts and in systems of thoughts and narrative structures. And they lose touch with their inherent ability to perceive in a fuller way, which has joy, has love, is beautiful, really. So it's a returning to that, which is a kind of a de-enculture, de-socialization. You have to undo these things, and then you have to kind of flip your mind around. You have to flip it around so that you can perceive what's primary, which is implicate. It's hard to talk about in words, right? In a way, right?
Well, it is, right? And, I'm glad we're talking about it in words because there's people out here who are this is going to lead them to trying to experience it themselves too. So, but yeah, once you have the direct experience of, the subtler elements of reality, it's pretty cool. And then I feel like when you get more in tune with that, synchronicities start to appear in your life. Do you find that?
Yeah. Okay. So remember when I started at the beginning, I said, like, there's history, theory, practice, and ethics/morality.
Yeah.
Now we're really in practice right now. We're talking about the path and the perception, and that's the engagement, the participation with everything else, frankly, because implicate, again, we'll use source. I don't want people to concretize that as the source. I don't mean it,
right.
But just for the sake of using a word, okay, we'll say source. This experience that really is like the path, I think, more and more, and it's not just perceiving that, because you then have to figure out how you're going to translate your perception of that into meaningful action in the world, right? So yes. That's kind of the path in a way, and getting a handle on that's interesting, because before I read so much of Bohm, and I'm talking years and years ago, I made up a practice for myself, I guess you could call it that, where I called it listening. I called it listening, but listening to the backdrop. And I realize now that that's what I was trying. I was trying to listen to the implicate, the backdrop. Now, I want to introduce something that's really important here, is the notion of form. Okay. So form is really a fascinating idea when you think about morphogenesis. How is it that something manifests, but arises, and it presents in a certain form, and then it dissolves back into the implicate? So there's this arising and dissolution, arising and dissolution, and everything essentially follows that. And that's the process of morphogenesis, the genesis of form. Now, we're enculturated, usually, let's put it this way, usually, most people are in today's world are enculturated in one of two ways to think about dissolution. Let's call, they're either taught essentially, or they believe that one's embodied form ceases to function in the way that they're used to it functioning, with, let's say, the ability to talk and walk and ambulate and all of this, that's it. Like, then the form is somehow over. So that's a kind of materialist reductionist way of thinking about things. Or they're kind of taught the opposite end of the spectrum, which is that, well, there might be a rapture, or the embodied form will come back to life, and it will come back to life like just the way it is now.
Yeah.
Right? Like just exactly the same way. And you could say that that's not materialist reductionist, that's like what Bohm would call idealist reductionism. And so I'll get into these two ends of the continuum of reductionism, because it's really important to, I think, how you think about things. But nevertheless, so people are either, they're in one or the other spot. And I'm trying to, in almost everything I try to write, I'm trying to say there's a middle road here. There's something in the middle that's not either extreme. And the middle is probably much more correct than either extreme. And so what I'm saying is, and what Bohm is saying, frankly, is that there's this arising from implicate into explicate. So one is going from the formless to the form, and then there's reintrojection from the realm of form back into the implicate, right? So you're going from form to formless, but it's a little subtler than that, because at the level of implicate, there's still some sense of form. Now, as you go out, from implicate to super implicate, super, blah, 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 the form, I think, becomes subtler. The attachment to the notion of form as we understand form becomes less and less. It's more and more formless as one moves out. However, in this key idea, and it's going to take us straight back to history, why history repeats. And it's one of the, it's like when you sit with it and assimilate this idea over a period of time, you start to recognize how important it is, which is that similar forms resonate at the level of implicate order. I mean, I almost tell people, I think I had it in the book at one point, the hyperconvergence book, that if you get just one idea from this book, it's that similar forms resonate at the level of implicate order. So I'll use a coarse example, and it's again, tragic example. But why is it if there's one mass shooting, then you see a spate of mass shootings quickly? right? That's because the actual form of the historical event, it occurs in explicate, right?
Mm-hmm.
It arises out of some, cognitive, we're going to call it just, delusion in the mind of the person doing the shooting, the cognitive delusion and the circumstances of all of this arises. It culminates in the event, and then the form keeps reverberating. Let's put it that way. It dissipates, but continues to reverberate at the level of implicate order. And then it's picked up again by someone else who's struggling. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do. Is it fair?
Okay.
Would it be a fair metaphor to say that that's kind of like that form is kind of sitting in the collective unconscious after it happens with the first person? I don't like to just kind of merge those two concepts,
Oh,
but
I know. So it's not exactly that, but it's like that.
Okay.
It's analogous to that. And the idea of, I've been thinking a lot more about the collective nature of consciousness too, and how that plays into all of this. Like, I'm talking, you're right to point out that the example I used was like an individual who commits some kind of atrocity,
Yeah.
right? But what happens when an entire people commit an atrocity, an entire culture commits an atrocity? Like, what's going on there at the level of form and ideation and belief structure, and how does that play out? That series of questions is analogous, but not the same as, like, let me put it this way, one could pursue that series of questions probably analytically in a useful way, in an analogous manner to how one might think about what implicate order is. But collective consciousness, all of that is still explicate.
Okay.
Wow. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It just it hit me as profound, but yeah, it does make sense.
It is. It's so
because if that's in the explicate, like that's huge to me already, right? Like collective unconscious is in the explicate. How massive is the implicate then? If that's
right. Okay, right now, but this is complicated. There's a level at which individual consciousness is in the implicate and collective consciousness is in the implicate too. So all I was responding to was your direct question, because see, once an idea is an idea, whether that idea is held by an individual or a small group or an entire nation state, it's already explicate.
Yeah. Okay.
See, at that point, we're already in the realm of form, and ideas are forms. So there are a few different things that are profound. I mean, I read Bohm and then I read it again and read it again. He had a journal article from 1990. I must have read that. I've probably read that thing 25 times, because every time I read it, I assimilate it more and more deeply, and I start to realize, oh my goodness, so there are, in addition to this notion of the framework, mm-hmm. the levels of subtlety of ordering principles, explicate, implicate, superimplicate, etc. In addition to that, he has a couple of other ideas that are just really important to think about in a regular way. And one is the wholeness of reality, that reality is a whole, and everywhere it functions the same. It's, and this is something I talk about, why I think it's not useful to talk about paranormal or supernormal. It's one reality. It's it's entirely inherently coherent. It's a whole. That's one thing. But another idea that's just massively important is that mind and matter are inseparable. And this is something that, it was Descartes who steered everybody in the wrong direction by postulating that mind and matter were separate. And that has just led to really maladaptive thinking, because what happens is when you think that mind and matter are separate, and this relates to the framework undergirding the two books that you mentioned, when you think that mind and matter are separate, right, you either fall down on this side or you fall down on this side. But you fall down. And most people fall. Most people fall. I'm trying to suggest to people, don't fall either way. Keep on the middle path, which is not falling. But what does falling mean? Falling is reducing, cognitive reductionism. So when I say people fall this way or this way, they reduce either to this extreme or they reduce to this extreme. The trick is not reducing at all, right? Mm-hmm. And we'll get to that in a second. But what are the two pitfalls? What are the two ways that the people fall? People either they fall to reduce everything. So they accept this idea of a dichotomy of mind and matter. So they start with a false idea, but everybody, it's so pervasive, right?
Yeah.
So people accept it, and then they either reduce to matter, and they're material reductionists, or they reduce to mind, and they become prone to, I would call it conceptual proliferation, like idea structures run amok, like narrative structures that are created out of the natural human propensity for creativity, which is a beautiful thing if you're aware that you're being creative and making something up. But what happens is on that side, people reduce to thinking that the idea structure that is in fact a human creation is literally true, right? And so the trick is to somehow experience existence in your embodied form without falling and reducing in either direction. So just starting to realize that in a way, a mental form is just a subtler version of a physical form. And again, I'm using words in a way that's imprecise, because the minute I use it as an adjective, I say a mental form, it sounds like it's different than a physical form. It's not really, it's a continuum of subtlety. Okay, so I just
they're a little ineffable. Yeah, they're a little ineffable by nature, right? When you're talking about the implicate and the layers of subtlety, like, and form that exists beyond the physical, like it's hard to all wrap that up in language, I guess.
Well,
in my mind,
I wasn't even there. You see, yeah. I'm not even talking implicate, really. Right now, I'm just talking, right now, when I talk about this mind-matter dualism, that's just happening at the explicate level. That's just a major a major error, cognitive error, that we're carrying around with us at the explicate order level. And that just causes all kinds of problems. It's just,
No, you're right. I think it's honestly the most fundamental problem. The whole, people leaning to one extreme of materialism or, idealism, right? And then there's a duality there that's at the core of everybody's worldview, and reality seems non-dual from what people like Bohm are saying. Is that okay? Would Bohm slap me on the wrist for saying that what
No,
you're
no,
saying non-dual?
non-duality, this notion of non-duality is much more correct. So we've got the non-duality of mind and matter. That's one kind of non-duality.
Yeah.
It's one genre of non-duality. And if you could just get that straight, right, then you wouldn't have the kind of conflicting methodologies, if you will, between science on the one hand, materialist reductionist science, which is not good science, and on the other hand, the methodology, one could say, in the hermeneutical interpreted, structure of theology on the other. And they're both wrong. Especially when it came time to write that second book, the hyperconvergence book, I'm like, I'm offending everybody all at once.
Yeah.
It's like, and I'm aware of that. I'm aware that almost everything I say is deeply deconstructive of things that people hold as core guiding principles for how they're approaching everything.
Yes.
And I don't mean, I'm not trying to be rude and deconstruct everybody's frameworks, but by the same token, these frameworks are not working. And we are, as a species, so close to self-extinction. And the amount of suffering that is tolerated at the geopolitical level is grotesque to me. And so you have to, at some point, you simply have to say, I don't think it's that way, and I don't think it's this way. I don't think it's either of those ways. We need to try something else. And that something else, just the experience itself, let's put it that way, I think is conducive to the cultivation of empathy in a deeper way. Because I think most people, when they're born, let's put it this way, of course, there might be some anomaly, someone whose wiring is just very mixed up and they become psychopathic or something. But most people have an inherent, innate sense of empathy. And then again, it's almost beaten out of you by your experiences in life, where again and again and again, people are unkind, or again and again and again, people lie, cheat, and steal. Again and again, it's like sometimes I think then what people react by saying, well, I've got, I should toughen up or something if I want to make it in this world and have status and money and all these things, and there's a crisis there because there's a loss of empathy. And then when that is scaled up, we see exactly the world we have. Terrible suffering, unconscionable situations. And so the question is, how do you present an alternative to that is accessible, that isn't cult-like? Because this is like the last thing I want is to suggest that this is like a new no. No, we already have a lot of religions. We don't need a new one. It's something that you simply can become more empathetic. You can cultivate empathy. I think it's almost, again, like a byproduct. It just happens. Like, let's put it this way. You can go in it this direction or you can go this way. Meaning you can say, you know what? I'd like to be more empathetic. I think that would be good. It would just be good to be more empathetic to others. And then you can say, well, what is a pathway to that? And you can say, well, maybe just becoming more aware of the subtle dimensions of existence and listening and being more immersed. And that will be a pathway to that. Or you can come in from the other direction say, I just want to know what's what. I want to know the nature of reality. I really am curious about it, you know? And you can enter from that door. And again, simply by going through it, you become more empathetic. So it's a kind of a win-win, regardless of what your motivation is.
Well, it's a win-win in a lot of ways. What really attracts me to this, and I'm hopeful others, is, this is not like a new religion to say is fundamental truth, but it is a pathway, and it's a pathway that could lead to not just inner peace, but that would then ripple out and affect other people in a meaningful way.
Oh, and I'm going to quiz you. Stop. And why? Why would it ripple out? And you use the Bohm metaphor. Bohm uses the metaphor of a ripple.
Yeah.
Why? Why, Ryan? You're right on top of it.
Is it the form lurking in the background of the explicate?
Exactly. It's because similar forms resonate at the level of implicate order. Yes. So if the better you can make the forms, the faster those good forms will resonate at the level of implicate order with all similar good forms, and then vroom, out into the explicate.
So this reminds me of something I've heard over and over about, like the 100th monkey thing, and I think maybe we talked about it. Like, actually, I don't know if that's an appropriate comparison. So strike that from the record. Let's pretend I didn't.
No. Okay, stop. So you're right on top of the same question you asked before. I don't know if you realize it's the same question. It's the same question. But that 100th monkey thing gets again into collective consciousness. So Sheldrake, kind of, okay, I don't think his morphogenetic thing is the be all and end all. However, he did do some interesting experiments and collected some interesting data along the way in Rupert Sheldrake, okay, biologist.
Yep.
Theoretical biologist. But one of the things he noticed, I was thinking about it, I was taking a walk today, because he noticed that if a little bird, figures out on some remote island how to get the top off of the milk carton that's set out, in the olden days when you had the milk carton with the things out on your front step or whatever, that then all the birds of that species figure it out, even though there's no linear connection between that one bird in that isolated location who figured it out and the rest of the birds. And so you can see immediately that this notion is that the bird figures something out. He's got the form of the process to get that little top off of the milk carton thing. And then somehow all the members of that bird species get it too. So that's an issue. It's kind of this issue of how is it that collective consciousness, and so Bohm and Sheldrake actually participated together in a dialogue because they could see that there was some sort of similarity in at least that aspect of things. And in fact, there's a really good book, Dialogue with Scientists and Sages is the title of the book. Okay. And I don't know if it's so easily available. I happen to have a PDF of the book if anyone would email me. But anyway, the point is that Bohm and Sheldrake are trying to work this out, right? And it's complicated because yes, at some level, that form of the first little bird that figures it out must go to the implicate, and somehow the members of that species can draw it out of the they never quite hammered it out perfectly, but they discuss it in some depth. It's a really fascinating question. But that is true of anything good, right? But unfortunately, it's true of everything bad too. So, however, I have started to think a lot about how one little bird can make a difference, right? Like if that one little bird, one little human being, not little, is clear enough on perceiving or understanding something about the nature of reality, I think there probably is a mechanism for the whole rest of the species to make a sudden, progression up. But it's also why it's so paramount that we don't allow ourselves to regress. Because the minute we regress, it's why I wrote a whole book about abolishing nuclear weapons. We cannot have another nuclear detonation in a conflict. Because the minute you have one, it's all that much more likely that you'll have many. And so we can't regress. And unfortunately, we're regressing quite a bit. And I'll just get this thought in and then stop. The irony is kind of counterintuitive. The irony is that we're regressing by means of technology, which we think of as advanced. So we think as our technology becomes more advanced, I don't like to call it, it's like more sophisticated, more lethal, especially our weapons technologies. What happens is that the minute we employ those, I hate to even use the word sophisticated, the second we will call them effective. I don't want to put any positive spin on the adjective that I use to describe advanced weapons technologies. So the minute they're put into use, right, then there's kind of a regression at the species level because killing becomes more efficient. So that's the path to extinction, right? And that's why this, and again, okay, now just to make a huge segue, well, maybe not so huge, but you realize that that's the same problem that, let's say, extraterrestrials are facing with how to intersect with humankind. Because the second there's an overreaction of any kind by someone who's in a position of power and has access to an advanced weapon system and happens to be operating under a deluded belief system that, let's say, aliens are demons, right? And overreacts, then it puts the entire species at risk, human species at risk. I'm confident the extraterrestrials are sophisticated enough to, get out of the way, but the humans become at risk. So if you happen to be in a very advanced extraterrestrial species and you're empathetic, you're by the physics of the matter, you're empathetic because you understand all of this subtlety. You
that is so important. I'm glad you're saying that.
Huge. Again, you can't get here if you're not benevolent, because the second you understand the physics well enough to even get here, you understand the wholeness of reality. You're already empathetic, a million things. And so imagine you're such a being, highly empathetic, you understand the physics, you see the delusional belief systems at the level of humankind, and you see the weapon systems. How do you approach? It's really a tricky question. And it's the same question as, how do we not go extinct?
Well, I know there's a lot of people out there that have been scared to pursue new paradigms of thinking, both because of just attachments to old, but I'm hoping that this Bohm interpretation is something people really want to consider looking at, because it's spiritual and scientific at the same time. And I think that's what a lot of the modern psyche needs. They can't get too into the woo, but they also they know there's something more here, that the world's not dead and cold and mechanical, and they want to honor that. And yeah, like you said, the urgency for people to at least consider something like this is insanely pressing. Like, we are every day on the verge of blowing ourselves up. And I'm sure it's so frustrating to a extraterrestrial civilization that's like probably understands our potential, and yet we can't seem to get out of our own ways to honor that potential and honor our interrelationship with the wholeness of the, Bohmian worldview. And I don't know. I'm scared. Obviously, that's kind of why I reached out. Like, hey, we need to talk and get this out to people so that we can be a small little bird and share some good news that can change the trajectory, and hopefully fast. But I'm also optimistic because there are mechanisms like this out there for people like me and everybody listening to go explore. I We're kind of at the top of the hour. I would love to keep going. I'm if you are.
Well, let
Do
me
you
say
have
something. Let me say something about ethics or
Yeah.
morality. Okay, so we've kind of talked about the path. Well, I'll say one more thing about. I'll say the ethics piece first, and then I'll swing back around to the path
Okay.
practice. So I remember back when I was many years ago being really intrigued by this question of utilitarian versus deontological ethics, and thinking that there was a lot there, like that was a really important question. And so the idea, and I talk about this a lot, it's in fact the basis for the book Extraterrestrial Ethics. So the idea there is, there are two kind of classical ways of thinking about ethical decision making, and one is utilitarian, which would say that the ends justify the means, and one is deontological. D doesn't mean not, it means in this case actually of, in a way, like of deontological, which means that the ends do not justify the means. So that, let me use a very direct example. Is it morally correct to kill a child to achieve an end? Right? Now, a utilitarian viewpoint might argue, yes, it is. And a deontological argument would be just, no, it isn't. That it's not correct to kill an innocent child to achieve any end because the act itself is morally incorrect. So, okay, those are very different ways of approaching reality as one is going through one's own life and making decisions. So when I talk about ethics, I'm not talking about rules-based ethics like the 10 Commandments or something. I mean, those are okay approximations, let's say, to kind of keep people in line if they're not particularly reflective people, let's say. And they just give them some rules, and generally those rules will be pretty good, whatever. But I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about morality like at a deeper level. And I would say morality has something to do more with what is good, like what is the best path to a good outcome, to the correct outcome, to a beautiful outcome, something more like that, right? So, but the issue is, and it's now reached a fever pitch, is that there's so much utilitarian thinking at the level of geopolitics. And foreign policy now is almost, and has been for decades, almost completely utilitarian.
Yes.
And people say, oh, that's Machiavellianism. I mean, they could, no, it's how the United States of America operates at the level of foreign policy decision making is it's almost completely utilitarian. The issue I've started to be thinking through, let me put it that way, is that it doesn't work. And I used to think it doesn't work, meaning the utilitarian approach doesn't work because in over enough of a period of history, it's strategically and tactically unsound. So, okay, so I kind of threw something in there. Utilitarian thinking is basically two manifestations of a utilitarian approach are strategic thinking and tactical thinking. Okay?
Yep.
Whereas when one is taking a deontological approach, trying to do a moral thing, I argue in that book, you're really thinking about ontology, the nature of reality, what is right and correct and good and proper in terms of the nature of reality. What's in what's the right resonance, but what's in tandem with the nature of reality itself, and that's how you get to the deontological ethical approach, or having a moral compass and trying to live by your moral compass. Okay, so, but the problem is, so much that happens right now is strategic and tactical in orientation, and it's for the purpose of utilitarian ends. It occurred to me that if you could just flip that, like if you could just start training people in, oh, I forgot to say one thing. So over a long enough period of history, that doesn't work.
Okay.
Because we see these cycles of violence, it just doesn't work, right? So I was thinking for a while, well, it's strategically unsound over a long enough period of history, and it's morally incorrect.
Right.
And then but then it like dawned on me just the other day, no, it's strategically unsound because it's morally incorrect.
Yes.
And it's out of resonance or out of tempo with the way things should be, like the health of the whole, the natural innate desire of the whole to be creative in a beautiful way.
Yeah,
that's
like,
why it doesn't work.
Well, because to me, it's like the whole inflicting self-harm. If you go it's like I hate this part of myself today, so I'm just gonna cast it aside for a different part of myself, which isn't.
You could that's a good way of saying it. It's and it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because it's unnatural in terms of wholeness. It's not efficient to the health or the beauty of the whole, and therefore it doesn't work. So but then it occurs to me, well, if your whole species is so mixed up that you're doing harm to the whole at a massive enough level, your species isn't that useful to the whole anymore.
Right. I was talking to an old professor on Thursday, and he was talking about how, or we were talking about like this concept of us we can either be cancer cells or like white blood cells in this universal system. And, if we're the cancer cells, we're not getting off this rock. We're going to die here and kill ourselves. And hopefully at least we don't take the planet with us. A new life could come. But, we have the opportunity, I think, to kind of be more like white blood cells and get out into the universe and do good and be creative and really just like express ourselves beautifully in this experience. I don't know what else to call it, because I'm trying to define what life is I guess what led me to be talking with you too, is trying to get to these big questions. But
well, it's more than life. It's like its existence.
Yeah.
You see, I think I don't think there's any kind of real end, it's just is kind of thing. And we absolutely have it within our power to be positive and to be conducive to the health and the creative and the beauty of the whole. We can do that.
Yeah.
And my point is, some of that is just by thinking differently and training ourselves to think differently and learning to think independently and not allow ourselves to be too socialized by systems that are clearly creating maladaptive patterns of thought. And so now this will kind of wrap it up here with going back to the path. And so I really am a huge proponent for people to develop very strong inner locus of control and question everything, inquire for yourself. Do not be too dependent on what anybody is telling you is the way it is, let's say with respect to UAP or anything else. Develop religion or anything. Develop your own experience of your own existence. Like that is very, very important. And again, it's all around us in the natural world. So to whatever extent you can disengage from the electronic interface and just go spend time out in nature and, throw a tennis ball to your dog, just live life in a joyful way that's not collapsed to two dimension by a screen or by an app on your telephone. And I think that's really important too. As a perceptual training, I would say try to get off your phone as much as you possibly could. Just turn the thing off, just ignore it, because perceptually it's limiting you.
Yeah.
That's it, just down to this, there's all this and you're being, that's really insidious. Just let go of the thing, and immerse yourself as much as you can in reality at a depth level. And of course, the easiest way to do that is walk outside, because it's all around you then. Get into nature, take a hike, swim, get in the water. I don't know, but I think, and then in the process of that, or, taking a walk, whatever, just what you want to do is quiet the conceptual proliferation. You want to quiet your mind so that you're not in some sort of cycle of rumination on a thought. You just want to just quiet it so you can hear, and you'll notice, first you'll start to hear the birds. I didn't even hear all those birds. And then you'll start to hear like little things in the twigs, or you're moving, and then you can like sort of take it from there. Just keep deepening that experience where you put in suspended animation and just sort of get out of your thought process these kind of repetitive thoughts about, this person annoyed me, or this, I have to go buy this at the grocery store, or whatever, right? You need to somehow learn to just leave those at the door, so to speak, when you walk outside, so that you can actually experience. And then that, I think, natural deepening process, just making yourself more open. And I think that's the same, frankly, it's the same route if you want to have, let's say, more of a relational approach and less of a data-centric, data collection approach to any other kind of species that is in our midst, right? So anyway.
It's the whole, I first got hip to this, and I really became a Richard Albert Ram Dass fan. Just the be here now. Like, if you can like be in the direct experience, that cultivates a lot of feeling of well-being, and almost, I'm not trying to be esoteric here, but like energy. Like, I feel like it's energizing to tune the thoughts out, or let them float on by, not attached to them, and just be. And yeah, nature just seems to be the place to facilitate that the easiest, at least in my experience.
Well, you have the depth dimension, and the depth dimension, how do I want to say this? Experiencing the depth dimension at the level of your five senses is a doorway into an even deeper experience of the subtle level of implicate, etc.
That's awesome. Yeah, it does. It
Okay.
does. It's like putting the key in the door. Like, hey, this is the first step to
Yeah.
going in and getting familiar with the potentially if infinite levels of the implicate.
Right. Right. So,
Well,
well,
very
it was fun to talk to you. Thank you so much for the invitation, Ryan.
Yeah, no, this has been great. And I know that everybody that's going to watch this is going to be super grateful. I think there are tons of nuggets of wisdom in there. And I really appreciate you putting a lot of emphasis today on practice. It's great for all of us to talk about, the other ways to consider living, but it's a whole other thing for us to operationalize action, put that into action. And I know you've been doing it a lot longer than most of us. So thank you. You're paving the way for other people. It's something I look up to, and I know others do. So thank you for being here, sharing your time with us. And yeah, we'll look forward to continuing reading everything you publish and put out there. As a huge fan of your work.
Thank you so much, Ryan. You take care.